All right, well, here's part two of the Age of Exploration. This part's not quite as long as the other, but I didn't want to mix them up, and the other lecture was already an hour, so let's make this a little shorter. Well, anyway, we were talking a lot about how the Crusades led to the Age of Exploration over time, over a few hundred years of trade growing into conflict with the rise of a Muslim empire and the issues with the Byzantines of the Eastern Roman Empire, and then Portugal basically figures out how to get around the chaos caused by the plague and a lot of warfare throughout Central Europe to get back to the spice trade by going around Africa. Well, now we get to a point where Spain is going to do the same thing. They're going to try to find a maritime route to get to Asia. And unfortunately for Spain, they're getting into the race late. They're getting into it after Portugal, which means Portugal basically owns, they've trademarked, if you will, with a very powerful new empire and the military that comes from an empire like that. Portugal has trademarked the African trade route, which means Spain can't go that way. So if Spain wants to connect itself, if it wants to compete, it needs to find another way to get to the Silk Road by sea, but not around Africa. They need to find a different route. So we need to talk a bit about why Spain is going to create a massive empire so quickly. Portugal created, let's go back to this, Portugal creates a fairly decent little trading empire around Africa, and they managed to get a lot. If you remember this slide, the Portuguese managed to get a lot of trading routes and trading partnerships over here. But you'll notice that the Portuguese don't just conquer a ton of stuff. They do take this part of Brazil, and they take some islands. But for the most part, the rest of this is just trading zones. Yet Spain is going to have a very, very different outcome. When Spain goes out to explore, they simply conquer everything. So we're going to look at the Spanish Empire, figure out why Spain was like that. Okay, that leads us to the rest of our story. Well, anyway, let's go back in time. 1090, right, the very same time that the Crusades were called by Pope Urban, right here in support, so to speak, of the Byzantine Christians over in Constantinople. And so the Crusades happen, and from the Crusades are going to be a number of Europeans that join in, I mean to say, which are going to be the Franks or the French and the English and some of the Germanic peoples. There is no Germany yet, but there's German speaking territories. And so these guys are going to be sending troops over to Jerusalem to fight and take land and start trade routes and all that stuff, right? Spain never sends people beyond priests. Spain never sends soldiers really to go to Jerusalem because Spain is going to get involved in its own thing. Now, right here is the Kingdom of Leon. And you might remember when we were talking about the expansion of the Muslim Empire after 600, you're going to see this Muslim Empire come all the way into North Africa. And then between 600 and, 630 really, and about 800, you see this. This entire region is captured by different Muslim tribes who come up from Africa and take over, which means the only Christian state of Spain left, only major Christian state of Spain, is this Kingdom of the Lion, which is not very big anymore. This is really more like the kingdom of the small kitty cat, maybe, at this point. And then there's a couple of other Christian kingdoms here, but they're not Spain. They're independent provinces. And then there's the French. And the French, together with the Spanish, helped to stop for a while at a big battle called Tours, helped to stop the expansion of the Muslim Empire into the rest of Europe. But this is it. This is right here. So right now we get to 1090, and the Pope declares a crusade against the Muslim Empire over in Jerusalem for that territory. But these guys here, the Kingdom of Leon, realizes that this is an opportunity for them. The Spanish that are left realize that if they can get the Pope to declare a second crusade, not the second crusade, but as opposed to that, another crusade on the other side of Europe, right here, then the Spanish can basically declare a state of emergency. And what that means is that the Spanish can basically grab anybody that doesn't, that wants to fight and that wants to live through the promises of profit through conquest and going to heaven for killing the infidel, which is what they're promised by the church. If any of these people that live throughout here don't want to go all the way to Jerusalem for whatever reason, but they still want to fight it in a crusade, then basically the Kingdom of Leon, or Spain, this little bit of Spain that's left, can get the papal approval to declare a crusade here. And that means that there's going to really be two crusades going on at the same time. They're over in Jerusalem. There's a first, second, third, fourth, fifth, all the way through through 14 different little crusades going this way. And then over here, there's one crusade that goes all these years, which is called the Reconquista. And that's the name the Spanish give it, the Reconquista. We are going to reconquer the Spanish Peninsula. You'll notice that there's no Portugal here. It's just because Portugal in 1090 doesn't actually exist yet. It's going to break away and create its own state later. But for right now, there is no Portugal, and that's just why it's not on the map. Okay, so what ends up happening is we have a Reconquista declared at the same time at the approval of the Pope in 1090. How long is this going to take? How long is it going to take for Spain and anybody that wants to help to actually conquer the Caliphate of Cordoba? And I want to mention something. I don't know if any of you that are listening to this lecture have ever been to the Irvine Spectrum, but the Irvine Spectrum has a whole bunch of neat features in it, Muslim features, in fact, from minarets or a minaret to fountains to tiles and other kinds of decor. And almost all of those come from models that are, more period, of course, more medieval, that come from the Caliphate of Cordoba, from right here. And so you could actually go to each of those monuments, those fountains of the minaret, and you could figure out what the actual version of it is, like the lion fountain and all that. And you could find the actual version of it, the real version that the Spectrum version is based off of, right here in a number of different, very modernized cities of Cordoba. Remember, these cities that the Muslims build here and that exist for quite a while, these cities are connected to this massive empire. So they have a whole lot going on for them and a lot of support. And so the little backwards Kingdom of Leon is going to have an uphill battle. How long does it take the Spanish, with a crusade declared called the Reconquista, to conquer the Caliphate of Cordoba? Well, 1090 it starts. 1120, they've made it a little bit over to the west and the east, this parallel here. By 1170, you've got about half of the peninsula is conquered. And then in 1400, the year 1400, by then, there's only one left. Guys, we're talking about this being a war of a crusade that ends in 1492. That is when this war ends. So the Reconquista starts in 1090, ends in 1492. That's a pretty long war. Add that up into your head. You've got several hundred years of constant warfare. And I want you to imagine the kind of people the Spanish become when they are not only starting a roughly 400-year war, but when the Spanish also win a 400-year war. What kind of nation are they when everybody in their country, to some extent or another, is engaged in fighting a war of conquest? No matter who you are, you're fighting a war. And so Granada is the last Caliphate of Cordoba or Muslim state in the Spanish Peninsula in 1400. And it takes all the way until 1492, 92 years before Granada finally capitulates and surrenders. Okay, it takes that long. So let's get to what happens then. Some of you might know that date, 1492, and you may know that date as the date of Columbus. So what happens, right, in 1492 when Granada falls and then Columbus, this guy from Genoa, Italy, walks in and says, I have an idea, and the Spanish hire him? Why would they do that? What's going on? Well, first of all, let's talk about who the Spanish become in this, real basically, the ideology of conquest. This is something the Portuguese are not doing, and no one else in Western Europe is really doing this yet, but the Spanish are, because they are involved in a 400-year war of conquest. So what kind of race are the Spanish going to be at the end of this thing? First of all, belief in this, the spoils of a just war. Spoils basically means what you can take when you win. So if you fight a war and you win, you get to take stuff, right? So the victors, the Spanish government rarely ever paid anybody to fight in their armies. They didn't have to, because essentially nobles would say, I am here to raise an army. And if that noble had a good reputation, soldiers would join at their own expense. They'd get their own horses and armor and weapons. And those soldiers, as essentially mercenaries, would join that Spanish noble and go fight. The commission principle here is in play, which is if you win and you don't die, in the process of winning, you get to keep part of the spoils. So a town that is captured, the people, along with other goods, are split up amongst the conquering army. And that's what creates a type of money through conquest that Spain is going to be using all the way through its days of empire. The concepts of who the enemy is. Well, are Muslims bad people? No. Are Muslims evil people? Not really. Not as a culture, right? Every civilization on Earth has its people that are problems, right? That are evil people. But being Muslim does not make you evil. It makes you different from, say, the Spanish, who are Castilian Spanish and Catholic. What does that mean? Well, the Spanish are fighting this war against other humans, and they've justified it through religion and culture by saying, if you do not look like us or worship the same God we do, we get to conquer you. And the Pope has said that we go to heaven if we die or live, and then we die of old age. We ultimately go to heaven because we killed some of you guys. Okay? This is a war of religious conquest, a crusade, if you will. And so these ideas of uncivilized people, savage people, brutal people, heathen people, nomadic or tribal or illiterate are all going to be ideas of rationalizations to conquer for the Spanish as they move forward. Once they've defeated the Muslims, who they have vilified in their culture as being evil people, the Spanish are going to go on and say, well, anybody else that's not like us is going to be ripe for conquest because we have decided that we are a race of conquerors and we can conquer these people. So if you speak Spanish and are Catholic and do what the Spanish do and act like the Spanish, you probably will not be conquered. But if you are in any other kind of culture than what the Spanish have, and you do not dress the way they do or act the way they do, the Spanish will see you as ripe for conquest. And so you should always be worried when the Spanish show up if you are not yourself Spanish. Okay, so, meaning back then, not now. Slavery. Europe and the Islamic Empire already had slaves. That was not abnormal. If there was fighting happening in the Mediterranean Ocean between the Muslims and the Christians, for instance, then both sides would take slaves. Well, the Spanish are going to take a ton of slaves from here. Okay, they're going to take a ton of slaves in this war of conquest, and that's going to be something that they keep on doing as well. Which means when Spanish armies of conquistadors, right, of conquerors, make it to the New World, guess what they're going to do? Conquer and take slaves, right? That's just who they have become in this 400-year war of conquest. So the idea of slavery will be applied in Spanish-held America as well, okay? Technological advances, the Spanish are going to be some of the first to develop a lot of the new technology into the Renaissance for their military above and beyond everybody else, okay? The type of gunpowder that can be put into cannons, the Spanish will really work with first, and the French will then kind of adopt it. The ships that the Portuguese built, the Spanish will take those ships, those caravels, and turn them into gun-toting warships almost before anybody else. Horses that are trained to carry armor into battle, that's nothing new, obviously. It's just that the Spanish developed better armor and better horses. They actually breed European Clydesdale-style horses with Arabian Moroccan horses and turn them into really fast war horses. And those horses are going to be something rather unique throughout European history as we move forward. What is the experience of this Reconquista, this crusade then? The experience of the long struggle to repel the Moors from Spain provided the Spanish with a deep military experience. Right? Let's keep that obvious and simple. And that deep military experience is going to allow the Spanish to not only be conquerors of various parts of Europe that they don't like, but obviously of the almost entirety of the New World when they get there. Okay? So the Spanish are a conquering race of people that are just looking for other people to conquer, and that's going to be an interesting story, I suppose, right? So, and the ability for the Spanish to conquer here and quickly take over and institute their own government inside of these regions that they conquer is going to help them be very efficient at setting up governments wherever they go after the Reconquista, i.e. the New World, and anywhere else in Europe that they want to go to. The Spanish go, they conquer and set up a government real quickly. Okay, so they're efficient conquerors after 400 years of warfare. Let's put it that way. So in 1492, Granada, that last Muslim state's about to surrender, and something really funny happens, okay? Really interesting. Christopher Columbus has been traveling throughout the courts of Europe trying to find somebody to hire him. Now, Columbus is one of many people who are professional mariners. They are ship navigators. They're captains who can be hired to carry cargo from one place to another. Okay. And so Columbus is looking for a job, but he has a very interesting idea, which is I have an idea, which is we can go set up a new trade route to compete with the Portuguese by sailing west instead of around Africa. And Columbus is going to go to the Portuguese, and he's gone to the French, and he's gone to a number of families in Italy, and he's tried to sell the idea that the Portuguese have gotten rich and famous by sailing around Africa. And Columbus says we can sail west around the planet and get to Asia that way. Hire me, I'll make that happen and make you rich. That's what Columbus's idea is. Here's some visuals, okay? So Columbus and the entire European world is familiar with this idea called the Ptolemaic map. Back around the 2nd century BCE, all right, well before the birth of Christ, the Greeks and the Romans had come up with this idea of what the world looked like. And yes, they knew the world was round. Okay, they were fully understanding that the world was not flat. Nobody thought that. It's just that they didn't think the world was, as big as it is. And one thing that is really cool, though, well, meaning not as big as it is, but they didn't think that the world had as many continents in it that actually exist because they had never gotten to the Americas, for instance. Well, anyway, this Ptolemaic map of ancient Greek and Roman era, okay, 1% off the true size of the actual globe. So theoretically, if somebody wanted to sail from Spain to go anywhere, they knew how big the world was and they knew how long it would take based on how fast they can sail. But here's something that was happening at the time of Columbus. There were a number of map makers, including Columbus, who began to think that the Ptolemaic map had miscalculated how big the world was. And they had begun to believe that the world was actually quite a bit smaller, 1/3 the size of the actual size of the planet. Why does that matter? Well, it goes like this. Columbus has an idea that he can get hired by somebody in Europe to pay him, to create a trade route to connect some European family or nation to a Silk Road by sea, the way the Portuguese did it around Africa. Columbus wants to do it by going west and therefore get all famous about it, right? Now, Columbus is under the impression, based upon his mistaken idea of how big the world is, that it is about 5,000 miles to get from Spain to Asia. That's how far he thinks it is. And he's wrong. Because, as you can see, the Atlantic Ocean, 4,000 miles, the American continent, a little over 3,000 miles, and then the Pacific Ocean, about 6,500 miles. By the way, nobody sails straight, okay? Nobody sails straight. When you're sailing a ship, you are going with currents, so it's actually much longer than 4,000 miles. You're going with ocean currents and wind currents and all kinds of other issues, repairs that have to be made along the way, and it takes much longer than even just the 4,000 miles to sail across the Atlantic back then. In fact, ships here are going to sail down to North Africa, stop and refuel, resupply food and water, and then sail all the way over here, resupply food and water, come up here, do it again, and then start moving up this way or down this way. But they can't just go straight. It doesn't work that way when you're sailing a boat by wind and tide. And so the deal is that Columbus thinks that he can take a ship from here to essentially China, which would be right here for him, or right here. And he's so wrong, it's laughable, except that he's going to get approval to do it because something happens. All right, so we're looking at 13.5 thousand miles to sail from Spain to Asia. No ship of the era, nobody in the world was building a ship that can go 13.5 thousand miles. It didn't exist, okay? The wood rots, the food runs out, the people starve, that sort of thing, okay? So how are you going to do it, Columbus? All right. Well, I'm just putting these notes up for you. Ship of 1492 could travel about 47 miles per hour, right? And Columbus could never have sailed from Spain to China in the real world. It couldn't have happened. But again, Columbus thinks the world is 1/3 of the actual size. By the way, when Columbus gets to Spain and tells the Spanish court, hey, I have this idea, The Spanish court is actually aghast. They laugh at him, and at the same time, Columbus is going to the learned men, the scholars of Spain, who are also priests, actually offered to try Columbus as a offer to the king and queen of Spain. They offered to try Columbus as a heretic and have him burned at the stake because they felt like he was a danger to society and was going to get people killed. That's a real thing. All right. Well, anyway, Columbus thinks that China is only 5,300 miles away, and it is possible for a ship at the time to make it that far. It's just really hard. Okay, I mean, you have to really prepare for it, and you're going to lose at least half your crew getting there. So this is not a light adventure for these guys. Okay, so the king and queen of Spain are going to hire Columbus to create this trade route. The reason they're going to do it, I need to go back to this map here. Okay, the reason they're going to do this crazy thing is because in 1492, Granada surrenders. When Granada surrenders, folks, the people of Spain, mostly the nobility especially, have been fighting a war for nearly 400 years. They don't know what to do now. They have nowhere to go conquer. They have been making their fortunes and paying their people, that work for them. And all, I mean, the entire Spanish economy, it seems like, is based off of conquest. And there's nobody to go conquer. They won. They won in 1492. So there was a bunch of people whose entire heritage, their entire way of living is now conquest and has been for generations. And they have nobody to go fight that they can easily go fight. And so the king and queen of Spain are sort of desperate. They're realizing that pretty soon, as the economy starts to shut down because of the lack of conquering to do in 1492, that Spain is going to end up in a series of civil wars, probably between nobles fighting over the resources that remains. And so the king and queen of Spain are going to do something kind of interesting, which is they're going to quietly, secretly, in fact, they're going to hire Columbus and hope that he can do what he says he can do. Because if Columbus is right and can sail west to get to China, then Spain can send all their nobles and soldiers to go that way along the trade routes, set up island bases, and go to China or India and not necessarily conquer unless they can do it easily, but at least be busy with trade, and that would be okay. And so Columbus is hired. He is given in this document here, which is really fun to read, actually. He is promised this. Columbus, if you actually take a bunch of Spanish people, take them across to China, and you don't die in the process, and you make it back with a trade route from Asia somewhere, we will not only make you a noble of Spain. This guy is a middle-class Genoan, all right? Columbus is going to be offered nobility in the courts of Spain, meaning he's going to have land and servants, and his son that's traveling with him is going to be a hereditary noble of Spain, and he's going to get this title, the craziest, awesomest Spanish title ever, Admiral of the Ocean Seas, whatever the hell that means, and he's going to get a ton and power and wealth. Why? Reputation on top of this. Being admiral of the ocean seas means that Columbus would be in charge of the trade route that he creates. So all the money and ships and trade, he'd be in charge of it, which means he gets a cut of all that, right? So this guy, if he manages to do this, is going to achieve some of the most impossible dreams of his day. And so he gets these 3 ships, all right, the Santa Maria, named after Saint Mary, okay, which of course is the mother of Christ, and hence he's got this caravel that he's going to take with him. That's obviously going to be the flagship that he's going to be on. It's named after a very important character of the Christian church. And then there is the Pinta, which is right here. The Pinta is going to be taking a bunch of people with them, and it's actually named. Well, I'll let you think about that for a minute. And then over here, the Nina, the smallest of the 3, carrying mostly supplies. The Nina is named after this, right? Nina in Spanish, little girl. Santa Maria, Saint Mary. Pinta in Castilian Spanish was actually a name that was sort of a joke. It actually meant painted lady, otherwise known as prostitute. So Columbus has Saint Mary, a little girl, and a prostitute, carrying all their people and supplies across the Atlantic Ocean, heading for China. And they make it. They make it to land. after about 4,000 miles plus some of sailing, right about the time that Columbus was getting really desperate and half his crews are dead of starvation and scurvy. And Columbus is going to make landfall right where he thought China or / India was supposed to be. Remember, he's using basically Marco Polo's ideas as to what Asia looks like. So, he's making this up as he goes. So he's so excited that he actually found Asia, and therefore he calls the area that he does find the Indies, and he calls the people there the Indians because he thought he found India. Okay? The deal is, guys, is that Columbus is going to go back to Spain as a hero. He's going to return, and he's going to have done something that nobody else in Spain has ever done. And so he's given his titles Admiral of the Ocean Seas, and he's given 1,000 men and 10 large caravels, and he's going to sail across the ocean and try to find the rest of India. He's only found some outlying islands, so he needs to go further to get to the rest of India and really start his trade route. Is what he says, is what he thinks, is what he believes, okay? Remember, his entire reputation, Columbus, is staked on the idea that he can sail west to get to India, and so he can't really ever believe, Columbus cannot ever believe or admit that he didn't do it, because everything, all of his dreams are pinned on that one thing. And so here's the voyages of Columbus, 1491, right here, and then 1492, he comes back, right? The Indies, all right. The West, the word West is added much later after people realize that this is not actually India. So on even today's maps, the Caribbean and the Bahamas are the West Indies, and India is, East Indies. So 1492, and then 1493, 1502 right here, okay, 1498 down here. So Columbus goes 4 times trying to find India in the big cities of Asia and never finds them. By the time Columbus dies in Spain, he still has his nobility, but he's not going to be in charge of anything. He's kind of discredited at this point. And other explorers, other Europeans and other Spanish, and even Italians are going to start making voyages trying to figure out how to get to Asia. They at least know that there's something here that they can stop at and refuel, re-water and re-food and repair their ships, but they don't know where Asia is. They just think it's here somewhere. So for a long time, people actually believed the world was 1/3 the size because Columbus managed to sail across and everybody thought that he had found Asia. Eventually, people reset the maps and redo all the math and realize that the world is as big as even the ancient Romans knew it was. It's just that there's something here, right? Okay, so this is the Spanish Empire by 1550. Okay, the Portuguese in 30 years have some islands, a little bit of Brazil, and some trading zones over here. The Spanish in between 1492 and 1550 are not only going to own most of North America and South America, but the Spanish are going to have taken some of the Portuguese territory in North Africa, and the Spanish are going to own territory here. Holland, they're going to have taken Italy. The Spanish are going to have taken all the islands of the Western Mediterranean and some territory in Germany. And we'll talk more about why. But I want you to notice that the Spanish have become a super empire. Okay, they are now the biggest empire on Earth. They own about 1/4 of the planet at this point because they are conquerors. And as these conquerors between 1492 and 1550 make it over here and further, they're going to conquer everything that they find. And that's what the Spanish do. How come the Spanish can do that? Because of the crusade known as the Reconquista. Okay, that 400-year experience of conquering that made them so good at it. Okay, so you're going to have some questions based on this lecture that are in Canvas for you. And that's it. Thanks a lot.